right, welcome everyone to my lecture today. I want to first thank the Korea Foundation for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you about something that I'm very passionate about, which is Korean language education in North America, specifically for young learners of Korean. I've titled my talk today, Korean Language Education in North America, Changes, Challenges, and Opportunities. And I'm going to touch upon each one of these three topics. What has changed? What are some of the challenges? And what are some of the opportunities? And hopefully give you a bit of a different perspective on Korean language education. I would like to first start by introducing myself. My Korean name is Ju Tahi, Dafna Zur. I am bicultural, binational. I have both an Israeli and an American nationality. I was born in the United States and I was raised in Israel. And when people meet me, usually the first thing they ask me is how I got interested in Korean. And so my answer is Taekwondo.
So when I was a young middle schooler in Israel, this was the time of when Korean soft power, the first sort of instance of soft power, which was in the form of martial arts, Taekwondo specifically, began to spread all over the world. And I was one of those kids who was really interested in martial arts because I watched a lot of martial arts movies. And so what started out when I was in middle school as a interest and a passion for martial arts grew over time in an interest in Korea, because Taekwondo was from Korea and I wanted to go and get my black belt in Korea and learn the Korean language. And so in the early 1990s, I left my family. I went by myself for the first time to Asia and just started learning Korean at the Yonsei Okdang. And also I started practicing Taekwondo.
This is a picture actually from 1998 when I was practicing with 강익필 관장님. And we went to the Hanmadang and won some medals. And I was very much part of this wonderful dojang that took good care of me and taught me about the physical and also the spiritual sides of Taekwondo. I know that there were some questions about what got me interested in Korea among the many questions I got. So I wanted to foreground that. And this is just to say that I hadn't planned on being a professor of Korean literature. It was sort of a series of happy accidents, but it's also a testament to the really powerful potential that soft power has. When people ask, what can interest in K-pop or Korean dramas or Korea in general, how can that generate lifelong interest? I think I'm a good example of how just one person who gets interested in Korea through martial arts can then go on to be a lifelong friend of Korea, an advocate for Korea, and an educator about Korea.
So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about changes. I want to say a few words about how interest in Korea has changed over the years, and to go on and talk about, before I talk about other challenges and opportunities. So when I ask young people today, both from elementary, middle school, and high school, and also in college, why are you interested in learning Korean? The answers I get look something like this. Some say travel, some express an interest in human rights in North Korea. A lot of young people will say family, somehow their families are connected to Korea. A lot of people say food, that they've tried Korean food and that really sparked an interest. Korean dramas and K-pop, of course, are very big. There's an interest in diplomacy, just in understanding the world through the Korean Peninsula. I want to turn your attention to the one in the center, this to be different, this idea of being different, because a lot of young people, when they're asked why they want to learn Korean, they recognize that Korean isn't always an obvious choice for a second language, but they think that there's something about Korea, its outsized presence in youth culture, It is not a language that's widely taught in the United States. So a lot of young people want to learn Korean so that they can be different. So these are some anecdotes. In other words, what I'm sharing with you are just some impressions that I have over the years working with young people. But we actually have data, strong data to show us what is actually happening out there with the Korean language.
One of the reports that we have from around 2016 is a report from the Modern Language Association, the MLA. The title of this report, and it's available online, it is Enrollments in Languages Other Than English in United States Institutions of Higher Education. It's the final report and it shows some really interesting trends, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of them. As of 2016, there were 150 higher education institutions that taught Korean. Korean has the fastest growing enrollments. In other words, while other languages are either declining or staying around the same number, Korean is on its way up consistently, and it is now ranked 10th in terms of foreign language enrollment. Let me show you some of those figures. So here we have a table that shows us the percentage of change between 1958 and 2016. This is in percentages. You can see that Korean has had a 53,500% positive change over time. So this is a story of massive growth, particularly if you compare it to other languages.
So that's one data point. Another is this one. It's a percentage of change over a much shorter period of time, 2013 to 2016. And here again, you see a 13.7% change. It may not sound like much, but if you compare it to what's happening with other languages, Russian has gone down. We have Chinese that's gone down. Japanese is maintaining very small growth, slow growth, 3.1. So most of the foreign languages in the United States in higher education are experiencing either very slow, stagnant change over time, small positive growth, or a decline is more common. If you can see all of the languages that have a minus number next to them, except for Korean. Korean in this period is really growing by 13.7%. So I think these numbers are really worth paying attention to. A lot of programs are paying attention. And a lot of people, not just in the audience today, but across the universities, are asking, what is it? Why is Korean growing so much? And do we have the resources that we need to respond to this growth of interest? And before I talk a little bit about how I understand these changes, I want to turn your attention to a really fine program that was created not too long ago. The title of it, as you can see, is 한국의 Golden Time, and it was created by the Platon Academy. And it featured many of the leading scholars in Korean studies in the United States and in Canada.
We gathered at Stanford in November, and we brought in experts from the fields of literature, from history, language, education, and social sciences to talk about the state of Korean studies, and in particular, how to understand the growth of interest in language and how it has also evolved into interest in higher education more generally. If you have time, I suggest that you look at this program. It's really interesting, and Choi Si-won from Super Junior narrates it. It's a lot of fun to listen to and to watch as well. These are some of the changes, the incredible astronomical growth of Korean. And so what's driving it? That's the one question we always get. And why do we see this change? What I want to talk about next is a little bit about what is behind this change and what are some of the challenges that come out of this transformation of the field. The first, maybe most obvious way to answer this question is that there is an incredible craving for all things Korean that has been generated by the amazing industry that is Korean popular culture.
I mean, I put up just a few images here of the most famous groups that come out of the big entertainment companies in Korea. I don't need to tell everyone here how much of an impact Korean popular culture has on youth culture. If you think about where BTS has showed up, where K-pop groups like Super Junior and NCT and Blackpink, where they're all performing, how many tickets they're selling. I mean, this is a really, really big deal. So yeah, I think that one of the kind of easy connections we can make between the growth of interest in the Korean language is this incredible way that Korean popular culture has penetrated youth culture all over the world. But it poses some challenges. So I'm going to call this the craving, right? I mean, the Korean popular culture has created this incredible craving for all things Korean, including and maybe most significantly in the Korean language. So what are the challenges? The challenges are, I would say, I put up 3 points here. The first is infrastructure. The second is scholarships, which is kind of related to infrastructure. And then the third, which is also related, is this idea of long-term investment. In other words, when I say weak infrastructure, I mean that countries like China, like Japan, many decades ago realized that they have to invest in strong language education, in resources, in positions for language teaching all over the world, including the United States. Korea was very late to this game. The Korean government in general has put in a lot less into the study of the Korean language overseas compared to its Japanese and Chinese counterparts. So we're starting really late. Korean is starting really late into this game of building a really good infrastructure for teaching Korean. Another part of this is scholarships. Even though there's a craving for Korean, if you don't help students learn the language, if you don't incentivize them the way that Japanese and Chinese language teaching does, you will lose a lot of really talented, really interesting students. You can't just assume that everyone has the money to spend on learning Korean and to go to Korea and to go to akdangs. You have to really push those scholarships into the field in order to support the learning of the language. Korean takes a long time to learn. It's a huge advantage to start when you're young. There are very few places in the United States, for example, that actually teach in a systematic way young people. And so building that infrastructure, pushing those scholarships is the way to answer some of these cravings. And this all translates into this idea of a long-term investment. In other words, when you invest in this way, in infrastructure, in scholarships, you're not going to see returns on your investments immediately, but you have to understand that these are very kind of long game moves. And you have to be willing, I think the government and other funding agencies have to be willing to take the time to see that investment pay out. And the payoff is huge. And I'll talk a little bit about that.
In the last portion of my talk, remember I've talked a little bit about the changes, about the growth of interest in Korean. I've talked a little bit about the challenges, about the lack of infrastructure or weak infrastructure, and very few scholarships, short-sightedness that needs to be changed. So these are some of the challenges. The last part I want to talk about is opportunities. So what's happening in terms of Korean language education, and particularly around this period now that we're affected by COVID, where things are happening online. I will talk very briefly about that, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some opportunities, and the one that I'm going to be talking about right now is the Korean Language Village. The Korean Language Village is part of a non-for-profit educational institution that is affiliated with Concordia College, and it is in Minnesota. The villages are based in Bemidji, in the woods of northern Minnesota. And this idea of language immersion or language villages came about in the early 1960s with some very progressive language educators who understood that if you can bring together these two great traditions of outdoor learning and language immersion, you can do some really special things with young people. This is a program that goes back to the early 1960s. It started with German in 1961, then added French, Spanish, Norwegian, Russian, Swedish, Finnish, Danish, Chinese in 1984. Japanese was added in 1988, and our village, the Korean village, was established in 1999.
So this village came about, as I said, in 1999 as a part of this chain, this collectivity of language immersion programs that, again, bring together the idea of an immersive experience where everywhere you turn, all around you, there's something happening in Korean that includes smells and sights and food and dance. You're hearing Korean all day. You get to experiment with Korean, to speak Korean, and it's all also it's all scaffolded. So the instructors and the counselors are all trained in the immersion pedagogy. Our program is 4 weeks long. We have 2-week programs and 4-week programs for around the 8 to 18 age group. And this program has seen incredible growth, just in the way that I showed earlier, where the numbers have grown exponentially over the world, and particularly in North America. It's true also for this program. One of the reasons that this program has grown so much is because there are so few opportunities for non-native young people, non-native Korean speakers, to find other non-native speakers and to learn Korean outside of Hangul Hakgyo, right? The Hangul Hakgyos are, of course, everywhere in the United States, but it's a kind of a different mindset, different training. This is a kind of, it's both immersion training and this sort of natural environment to learn Korean. And so what I want to emphasize is what the Korean Language Village does really well. Again, we're talking about opportunities. What does the Korean language do well? And it does spectacularly, I would say, because of 3 reasons. The first is in the realm of authentic communication. The second is in community building. And the third is around this idea of courageous global citizenship. So I want to talk a little bit briefly about each of these. The first is this idea of authentic communication. So when, we know studies on second language acquisition show us that classrooms are generally not the best places, not the easiest places to create authentic opportunities for foreign language use, right? Everyone is sort of sitting forward. There's a limited amount of time. There's one teacher with many students, and you're kind of getting through grammar. Everybody maybe gets one chance or a couple of chances to practice that grammar, and you move on. It's not what we would call authentic communication. And there is a scholar from, now an emeritus scholar from Berkeley, who has written quite extensively about this idea of affect, of emotion, and how emotion is so important to learning language. And she writes, and I quote, this is Professor Claire Kramsch from Berkeley. She writes, quote, "Many adolescents find in a foreign language a new mode of expression that enables them to escape from the confines of their own grammar and culture." So the idea here is that when young people come to learn a foreign language, what they're looking for, what keeps them hooked and keeps them engaged and turns them into lifelong learners of that language. Of course, it can start in different places with an intellectual interest, with a hobby, but what keeps them learning is this idea that you can discover who you are and be creative in this new language, not necessarily continue who you are, not necessarily extend who you are, let's say, in the environment in which you are raised, but you can actually be something different, try on something new, a new voice, a new name. And so building on what we know about language pedagogy, I can say that this is one of the reasons that learning Korean specifically in this kind of natural environment is so powerful, because what we do is we create opportunities for authentic communication. So this is created by counselors who speak Korean all day. You learn something in your language activity and immediately you go out to the outside world and you communicate with others and you get to use what you learned. You learn something in the class and then you hear it repeated by other villagers, by your counselors. You get to try it on either while you're doing taekwondo or while you're learning kayagum or while you're singing pop songs or while you're making dojagi, ceramics, while you're practicing it at the store, maybe at the 식당 while you're eating, you learn table manners. So there are all these really flexible, creative ways that you can learn Korean, and that's why the village is such a good place for that. The second is community building. We live in small cabins. We share our sleeping space, our eating space. And so part of it, of the magic of this program is that it brings together children from all over the country and all over the world. In fact, usually we draw from about, we have a representation of about 33 states that come to our village. So think about it. I mean, especially at a time of such political polarization, that you have children together from everywhere, from the East Coast to the Midwest, to the mountain region, to the South, to Hawaii, to Alaska. Everyone comes together with this shared passion for Korean. We also get international villagers who want to learn Korean. They're young, they don't have a place to go, they come to us. So it's this idea of bringing a community together and joining people in their interest in Korean. And the last point that I think the village does so well is this idea of encouraging courageous global citizenship. And what I mean by that is that courage is created or fostered in many ways. The first is the idea that you just get up in front of people and speak in a foreign language, in a language that is not your native language. The courage to do that, what it requires is huge, right? We're always afraid of making mistakes. We're always afraid of what if we're not understood. And this village creates an opportunity for young people to try Korean, to try on their language and not be afraid of making mistakes, and to know that everyone is always on a journey, on a path towards, we're always learning, we're always improving. There's no sort of, arrival. There's no point where you've learned all the Korean that you're ever going to learn and that's it. No, we're always learning, we're always improving. So that's sort of one idea of courage. The other is what we try and do in the village, what we successfully do in the village, is that we create opportunities for villagers to start with Korean, but to use their Korean to understand more about Korea and to realize what a deep and rich and interesting and complex and sometimes very difficult place Korea is. So we will do programs about the history of labor and protests, or we will do programs on North Korea, or we will do programs on migrants, or we will do program on dialect, or we will do programs, of course, on K-pop. So we use language, and it's all in Korean. We use language to teach young people not just how to use their language in a functional way, but how that can open up an entire rich world that our villagers then go on to pursue as a path of passion. I want to talk a little bit about continuing in this vein of opportunities. This village, we have been operating out of the Russian buildings because we didn't have our own buildings. And recently we received a $5 million gift from the CEO of the Simon Corporation, Kenny Park. And what you see in front of you is these are the drawings for the Korean village that is currently being built. The funds that we got from the Simon Corporation and from Kenny Park, 회장님, are enough to start this project. We're still building, looking to fundraise for more buildings, but this is the home of the Korean language village. So not only are we creating authentic communication, but we're building also the environment that can reinforce that communication. I wanted to speak a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's so specific to the moment, and hopefully this moment will pass. But we are now all in quarantine. I'm speaking to you from my bedroom. I have not been to my office since March here at Stanford. My children are doing school online. It's been a really, really difficult and challenging 6-7 months. And this past summer was the first summer in the history of Concordia Language Villages where our programs could not meet in person. So all of our villagers, everyone who wanted to learn the language, everyone was home. And so we had to pivot and come up with creative ways of doing those things that I just said. In other words, all language teaching was online everywhere. So, we tried to think about what Concordia Language Villages, what does the Korean Language Village do really well that we can try and sustain this summer. And so what we did is we created opportunities for our villagers to sing together, to exercise together, to respond to skits together, to do research projects together, to speak Korean online with their instructors. And so we tried to tie in all of these sort of special programs that we do in a regular summer in the hopes that, it's only one summer. We hope that we can be back in person this coming summer. But I wanted to share with you one result. So one of the things that we do at camp, we do in our program in the Korean Language Village is we sing. We sing all the time. We sing camp songs that we invent. These are our own camp songs. We sing famous Korean 동요. We sing K-pop songs. We do a lot of singing. And the reason for that, and this is all documented in research, is that singing is a very, very powerful way of internalizing language, both the rhythm, pronunciation, but it also goes straight to the heart. And one of the songs that is very popular in our camp is the song that we call the 친구 song. And I want to show you what that looked like this summer. So I will turn this on. So what you saw in this clip were faces of villagers, of staff, former villagers, former staff. These are just a few of our members who came together to sing the camp song. And we did this with all of our songs. So we have multiple songs in our village, and we were able to kind of bring people together in this way. So I would like to stop now and address some of your questions from the list that I received. And I apologize that I'm not able to answer every one of them in order. But what I did is I brought together some questions that I thought had some shared, some shared elements. And so I'll go down the list, and hopefully this will have answered your curiosity. So one of the questions, or many of the questions raise this one of what do learners of Korean find most impressive about the Korean language? And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but one of the things that always grabs me is that, of course, they'll say that they really love Korean because they love K-pop or they love Korean dramas. They want to be able to understand without subtitles, or they really like the writing system. But this idea of being different, I think what people really like about Korean is that it's just different. It's unusual. it's striking, and that's what draws a lot of learners to the Korean language.
I get asked this question, what is the hardest thing about learning Korean? And I would say that, again, unlike our Japanese and Chinese counterparts that have had a long history of teaching their language, the Korean language in North America, the situation of teaching Korean right now is still really weak in terms of infrastructure, in terms of resources, like I said, books and study guides, and also scholarships. So I think that is what makes Korean a lot more difficult to learn. There are just fewer opportunities, and there's a weaker infrastructure. Third question, how can Korean language education open the door to a deep experience of Korean culture? As I mentioned, in a program like ours at 숲속의 호수, we are always trying to connect the Korean language to Korea as a place that has a history, that has a culture, that has a lot of diversity, that has a very complicated past, and we don't shy away from it. We do not try and paint this rosy picture. We know that our villagers are really interested and they're serious learners, and they want to know everything that they can. And so we try to use the language to teach them about all the different aspects of Korea. The Korean Language Village is a very natural place to do that. What do students do with the Korean language? What kind of careers does it support? Students who learn Korean as young people go on to study Korean as adults many times. Many of them actually insist on going to colleges where they can continue to learn Korean. So one of the things that learning Korean as a young person can do is that it can set you on a path to continue learning Korean for life. As far as careers, they run the gamut, everything from teaching English in Korea to working professionally in Korea, to careers that have nothing to do with Korean. I had a student at Stanford who studied Korean. Her Korean was excellent. She went to law school. Another one of my excellent students went to medical school. When students apply for jobs, their experience of learning Korean shows that they are different, that they have something really cool and interesting about them. It's not like others. It can really open the door to any kind of career experience, not necessarily having to do with Korea. There's this question. I want to teach Korean overseas. What should I be thinking about? And this is a really interesting question. I think one of the important ideas that a lot of people who may be interested in teaching Korean need to be disabused of is the idea that being a native speaker automatically qualifies you as a language instructor, and it doesn't work that way. In other words, when you train to teach Korean to non-native learners in the United States, your goal isn't to turn students into native speakers. It's not to make them into Koreans. Instead, you're granting them the ability, which is one of a long-term trajectory, to explore the language, to get familiar with it, and then to get as fluent as possible in the language. But to be able to do that, teachers themselves have to be bilingual, bicultural, to understand what it's like to learn a second language that your students are learning. So one of the really important things about teaching Korean overseas is that you yourself, the person who's interested in teaching, needs to have had that experience of learning a second language and living overseas and understand what that process is like. And you have to get trained, not just in 국어, not just to understand Korean linguistics or Korean grammar, but trained in applied linguistics to become an effective communicator, an effective teacher of language. Finally, how can I support Korean language learning for students overseas? For those who are watching this lecture, who are excited about the things that I talked about, who, like me, think that the Korean Language Village is an amazing program and that we need to support it, then there's always room for support of scholarships for our villagers, scholarships to help us build our buildings and create this incredible environment. I would say that if you're interested in supporting the learning of Korean overseas, look into ways that you can help our program specifically at the Korean Language Village. But just know that these are long-term investments, that you can speak to your congressional or your district representatives and make sure they understand also how important it is to have this sort of long-term vision, long-term investment. And remember that every young person overseas that's not a native Korean speaker who falls in love, like I did, with the Korean language, with Korea, can become a lifelong friend, a supporter, an advocate, a bridge between their culture and Korea, and become an educator like myself. I am in an incredibly privileged position to be able to teach what I love, which is Korea. And every young person who is learning Korean can grow up to be, like me, a lifelong friend of Korea and an advocate. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for listening to my lecture, and I hope to get more questions and to continue the conversation on this topic. Thank you very much.